Most gardeners think weeds are just part of gardening. You pull them, spray them, till the soil again next spring, and somehow they still come back thicker than before. I used to think the same thing. Every March, I would stand in the backyard looking at a freshly tilled bed, feeling optimistic for about 3 days. Then the first little green weeds would start showing up again. And by early summer, it felt like I was losing the same battle for the 10th year in a row. What finally made me question the whole routine was seeing an older garden that barely looked managed at all. The rows were not perfectly sharp. There were no bags of chemicals stacked nearby, no loud machine parked next to the shed, but the soil looked dark and soft, almost like damp chocolate cake after a rainstorm. Hardly any weeds. The tomatoes were tall, beans climbing quietly up rough wooden poles. Everything looked strangely calm. And the oddest part was hearing that the ground had not been tilled in decades. Honestly, I did not believe that part at first. Most gardeners are taught the opposite from the beginning: break up the soil, turn everything over, start fresh every spring. That is supposed to help the garden breathe. At least, that is what I always assumed. But after enough seasons of sore knees, cracked soil, and weeds showing up faster every year, I started wondering if the constant tilling was doing more harm than good. If you have ever spent an entire Saturday pulling weeds only to see them return before the month is over, you probably know the feeling. At some point, you stop feeling productive and start feeling trapped in a cycle. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if some of the work gardeners do every spring is actually restarting the problem? That question quietly changes how you look at the soil, because the first thing most people notice after tilling is how beautiful the bed looks. Loose dirt, clean rows, no visible weeds. It feels organized, controlled, like progress. Mine always looked perfect for about 2 weeks. Then the surface would crust over after a few heavy rains. Tiny weeds would begin appearing everywhere, usually thicker than before. By midsummer, the parts of the soil felt almost baked solid. Water pooled on top instead of soaking in properly. At first, I blamed the heat, then the lack of rain, then poor compost. Looking back, I should have noticed the patterns sooner. Every time the soil got turned over, more weeds followed. The strange thing was, the weeds often showed up fastest in the areas I worked hardest on. That is where many gardeners accidentally make things harder without realizing it. When soil gets disturbed deeply every season, buried weed seeds get pulled closer to light and moisture. Seeds that may have stayed dormant for years suddenly wake up. Some of them have been sitting underground a very long time, just waiting for the right conditions. Most people never see this happening because the process starts below the surface. You till the bed. The ground looks clean. Then, after the next warm rain, thousands of tiny green threads start appearing almost all at once. I remember kneeling beside one raised bed after a spring storm and noticing how evenly the weeds were spread. Not clumps, not patches, everywhere. Like the soil that was when I started paying closer attention to what happened underground after tilling. Healthy soil is not just dirt. It is layered, alive, full of tiny pathways holding moisture and air together. Earthworms move through it. Fine roots stretch through old channels left behind from previous seasons. Fungal networks slowly connect one part of the bed to another. Most of that structure builds gradually over time. Then a tiller comes through and tears the whole thing apart in 20 minutes. At first, it does not seem connected. The bed still looks soft on top. But deeper down, the soil slowly loses its sponge-like texture. Water drains differently. Moisture disappears faster during heat waves. Plants struggle more during dry weeks, even when you are watering regularly, and this is the part nobody explained to me years ago. Soil that gets left alone often becomes easier to grow in over time, not harder. That sounds backwards at first. Most gardeners assume untouched soil must become compacted. I certainly did. But some of the healthiest garden beds I have seen were never churned up every spring. Instead, The surface stayed covered, damp underneath, full of worms, soft several inches down even during summer heat. The deeper changes take longer to notice. One thing that stood out immediately was how rarely the soil surface sat exposed. There was always some kind of covering. Leaves, straff, grass clippings, sometimes plain brown cardboard hidden underneath mulch. The cardboard part sounded ridiculous to me the first time I heard about it. I honestly thought people were just trying internet gardening tricks again. But after fighting weeds for years, I figured it was worth trying in one small section beside the fence. I did not pull the grass first. That surprised me. Every instinct told me to clear everything out completely before starting. Instead, I cut the growth low, soaked the area with water, then laid overlapping cardboard across the ground. At first, it looked messy, not impressive at all. Then I covered it with compost and a layer of old straw from the chicken coop. A few weeks later, I noticed something strange. The soil underneath stayed damp far longer than the surrounding beds. Even during hot afternoons, when the uncovered ground nearby had already dried and cracked, the mulched section still felt cool underneath. When I lifted one edge of the cardboard after a rainstorm, earthworms were packed underneath it. Not one or two, dozens. That was the first time I realized the garden was responding to being left alone. Weeds still appeared occasionally, but nowhere near the explosion I was used to seeing after tilling. Most of the stubborn grasses never pushed through the cardboard at all. The few weeds that did appear were easy to pull because the soil underneath stayed loose and moist, and the cardboard slowly disappeared on its own. That part surprised me too. By the end of the season, large sections had already broken down into the soil. No plastic mesh to rip out later. No shredded landscape fabric tangling around roots. Just softer ground underneath. But weeds were only part of what changed. The plants themselves started behaving differently too. Tomatoes held moisture longer between waterings. Lettuce stayed tender deeper into warm weather. The surface no longer turned into a hard crust after every storm. Even during dry stretches, the beds seemed steadier somehow. Not perfect, just calmer. And that was when I realized most of my gardening problems had probably been connected all along. Once the soil stopped getting disturbed constantly, other small patterns started becoming easier to notice. For years, I thought weak plant growth usually meant the garden needed more fertilizer. That is what most gardeners assume. Leaves turn pale, tomatoes stall out, peppers stay small, and the immediate instinct is to feed the soil harder, add more compost, more nitrogen, more supplements. I did the same thing. Sometimes it helped for a while. Sometimes it barely changed anything at all. What confused me most was seeing two plants growing only a few feet apart behave completely differently. Same sunlight, same watering schedule, same compost pile. Yet one plant looked deep green and healthy while the other struggled through the entire season. At first I blamed bad seedlings, then weather, then insects, but the real issue was happening underneath the soil again. A lot of gardeners eventually noticed that certain natural amendments work beautifully one season and poorly the next. Coffee grounds are a good example. People hear they add nitrogen and improve soil texture, so they start tossing them everywhere. I did exactly that. Every morning, I dumped used grounds around the tomatoes, thinking I was helping. For a little while, the plants actually looked greener. Then, some of them stalled completely. The leaves curled slightly. Growth slowed down. Fruit production became inconsistent. And the strange part was, the soil looked rich on the surface. Dark, organic, healthy enough. Nobody mentioned the balancing part. Spent coffee grounds can help soil biology gradually over time, but heavy use without balance can slowly push soil conditions in the wrong direction. Not overnight. That is what makes it hard to notice. The changes creep in quietly across multiple seasons. An older grower once told me something simple that stayed with me. He said healthy gardens are usually balanced more than boosted. That changed how I approached amendments completely. Instead of constantly adding stronger products, I started paying attention to how different materials interacted together. Wood ash was another example. Used carefully, especially from untreated hardwood, it added minerals that fruiting plants seemed to love, but too much all at once caused problems fast. I learned that lesson the hard way. One spring, I sprinkled dry ash directly into several planting holes before transplanting peppers. Within days, some of the young roots looked stressed. Growth slowed immediately. At first, I thought cold nights were responsible. Then I noticed the plants in untreated holes looked perfectly fine. The ash itself was not the issue. The concentration was. That was when I started seeing why experienced gardeners move more slowly with soil changes. They are usually watching long-term reactions instead of chasing instant results. Eventually, I settled into a much gentler approach. A small handful of coffee grounds worked into compost, a diluted soak made from hardwood ash water used occasionally around heavy feeders. Nothing extreme. Nothing dumped heavily into one spot. The results were less dramatic at first, but far more consistent over time. Tomatoes developed thicker stems. Pepper leaves stayed darker through hot weather. Plants seemed to recover from stress faster after storms or sudden heat waves. And the garden stopped feeling like it needed constant correction every week, which explains why some gardens improve gradually, while others suddenly seem to stall out for no obvious reason. The deeper health of the soil usually changes slowly. That becomes even more obvious after harvest season. Most gardeners finish pulling crops in late summer or early fall and leave the beds bare until spring. I did that for years. Cleaned everything up. Exposed dark soil. Felt productive for about a day. Then, winter rains would hit. By spring, the surface often looked compacted again. Weeds appeared immediately. Moisture disappeared quickly. Once temperatures rose, what surprised me was realizing nature almost never leaves soil uncovered on its own. Empty ground always gets reclaimed by something eventually. That is where cover crops quietly change everything. The first time I planted cereal rye, I honestly expected very little from it. I scattered seed across one section late in the season, mostly because I was tired of looking at muddy, empty beds all winter. Within a couple weeks, the area turned green. Nothing dramatic, just a soft layer of growth slowly thickening. As temperatures cooled down, through winter, the rye kept holding the soil together while the surrounding uncovered sections stayed exposed to rain, wind, and temperature swings. By early spring, another difference became obvious. The rye-covered soil stayed softer underneath. Even after heavy rain, it did not crust over as badly. There were fewer weeds germinating near the surface. Moisture stayed more stable during warm afternoons. The bed felt protected somehow. At first, it looked unrelated. Then growers started noticing that certain cover crops naturally suppress weeds while they grow, and even after they are cut down. Rye was especially good at it. Once chopped and left across the surface, it formed a loose mat that blocked sunlight from reaching many weed seeds underneath. The garden felt quieter after that. Less sudden weed explosions. Less exposed dirt drying into hard chunks by July. Les constant maintenance. And maybe the biggest surprise was realizing how little effort the cover crop itself actually required. Scatter the seed in fall. Let the weather handle most of the rest. By spring, the garden already feels different before planting even begins. That was hard for me to accept at first, because most gardening advice sounds like productivity depends on doing more work, more inputs, more correction, more intervention. But many experienced growers slowly move in the opposite direction over time. They disturb the soil less, cover it more, and start paying attention to what naturally stabilizes the garden instead of constantly resetting it. And that is when another pattern started becoming impossible to ignore near the soil surface. Once the garden stopped getting tilled every season and the beds stayed covered more consistently, the whole place started feeling more alive in small ways I had never paid attention to before. Not dramatic changes, quiet ones. More insects moving under mulch after rain. More earthworms showing up when planting. Fewer empty patches of exposed soil baking in the sun. Even the moisture in the beds felt steadier from one week to the next. And then there were the nighttime helpers most gardeners rarely notice at all. One evening after watering, I walked outside with a flashlight because something had been chewing tiny holes through a few leaves. I expected to find slugs. Instead, I noticed movement all across the mulch surface, small dark beetles darting between bits of straw and leaf litter. At first, I barely thought about them. Later, I learned many ground beetles spend the night feeding on weed seeds and soft-bodied pests hiding near the soil surface. The strange thing was, I had probably been destroying their habitat for years without realizing it every time I stripped the beds bare and tilled everything clean. That realization stayed with me. A lot of gardening advice unintentionally treats the entire garden like something that needs constant sterilizing. Remove every leaf. Expose every inch of soil. Start over each spring. But healthy gardens often behave more like layered ecosystems than clean, empty workspaces. Once I stopped fighting that idea, maintenance gradually became easier. Not effortless, just less exhausting. Clover between rows helped too. I resisted that one for a long time because I assumed any extra growth near vegetables would compete too aggressively. But low-growing clover created a living carpet that shaded exposed dirt and softened the appearance of the garden. Pollinators started lingering longer around flowering vegetables. Soil stayed cooler underneath during hot afternoons. And the weeds had less open space to invade. That was another lesson I learned slowly. Nature usually fills empty space. If vegetables are not covering the ground and mulch is missing, weeds often take the opportunity first. At first, the clover looked messy to me. I was used to gardens with sharp, clean rows and bare pathways. But over time, the mixed textures started feeling healthier somehow. Less harsh, more resilient after storms and heat waves. The garden no longer seemed dependent on constant rescue. There were still difficult seasons. Of course, heavy rains still flattened certain plants occasionally. Dry weeks still stressed shallow-rooted crops. Some summer's insects arrived earlier than expected. None of these methods created a magical perfect garden. And honestly, that is part of why they became easier to trust. Experienced gardeners rarely talk, like everything works flawlessly all the time. They know every yard behaves differently. Different rainfall, different soil texture, different temperatures, different sunlight patterns through the season. But there are certain patterns that keep repeating. Covered soil usually holds moisture longer. Undisturbed beds usually produce fewer weed explosions over time. Healthy soil structure often improves gradually when left alone. And gardens supported by mulch, cover crops, insects, worms, and living roots tend to stabilize themselves better season after season. Most people notice the difference gradually, usually sometime in the middle of summer. That is when the contrast becomes difficult to ignore, i.e. Whoa. One bed still needs constant watering while another stays damp underneath mulch. One section erupts with weeds after every rainfall, while another barely changes. One patch turns hard and cracked, while another stays loose enough to plant by hand. Those small observations slowly reshape how you approach the whole garden. For me, the biggest change was psychological as much as physical. Gardening stopped feeling like endless correction. I stopped rushing outside every morning, looking for problems to fix immediately. The garden became quieter, more predictable. There was less panic after storms, less frustration during hot weather, less feeling that I had somehow failed every time weeds appeared, because weeds were no longer being invited back constantly by the way I handled the soil. That realization took years longer than it probably should have. I honestly thought harder work automatically meant better gardening. Many people do. But some of the healthiest beds I have seen belong to growers who disturb the soil very little and spend more time observing than forcing things. They notice where moisture lingers after rain. They watch which mulch breaks down fastest. They pay attention to where worms gather. They notice how exposed dirt behaves differently from covered ground by midsummer. Small details. But those details quietly shape the entire garden over time. And maybe that is the real lesson underneath all of this. The goal is not just growing vegetables, it is building soil that improves instead of resetting itself every spring. Once that process begins, the work changes. You pull fewer weeds because fewer seeds are being exposed constantly. You water less often because covered soil holds moisture longer. Plants recover faster because the ground underneath stays more balanced. Even the garden itself feels calmer to walk through. The strange part is, none of these changes happen overnight. Most gardeners trying this approach probably will not see dramatic transformation in a single weekend. The improvements usually arrive slowly across seasons, but that also makes them believable. One year, the soil feels softer. The next year, weeds thin out noticeably. Then one summer arrives where the garden suddenly seems easier to manage than it used to. Not perfect, just healthier. And once growers experience that difference, many of them never go back to aggressive tilling again. Because the real change is not simply fewer weeds or bigger harvests. It is realizing the garden works better when the soil is treated less like a machine and more like something living that already knows how to rebuild itself over time. If you have been feeling stuck in the same cycle every spring, maybe start small. One bed, one section of the yard, leave the soil covered. Disturb it less. Watch what changes underneath the surface over a full season. Most people never look at their garden the same way afterward.